And that should be going. So big welcome to everyone today. On our 12th subject, one of the things that we are wanting to look at today is the ways in which your interaction with other people, which we've been looking at over the last few weeks, is going to be important in the essays that you write. As a matter of fact, one of the major ways in which you receive grades and marks in any subject at university is through essays that you write. And so it's important for you to be aware of where in your critical thinking ideas are coming from different scholars and the strength or weaknesses of these different scholars. It's important for you to be aware of how when you put your essays together, the very structure of your essays reflects the thinking and clarity that you have about the topic, and that's often where your grades come from, which is why editing is important. And then it's important at the conclusion of writing a piece of work, whether it be a poem or painting a picture or writing an essay or a journal article for a scholarly journal, that someone reviews it at some stage. And it's most common when writing essays that your teachers will send you some feedback, and we often forget this is vitally important. You learn so much from that. So today we're going to spend 55 minutes or so looking at some of these processes. Let's begin, as we do each week, with some Bible reading, in which we're reminded from Proverbs 16 to commit our way to God, and our plans will be established. But I'm sure there's a bit of work involved. There's the law of work and return that it speaks about wisdom in the Bible. And Proverbs 2:6, the Lord gives wisdom and knowledge and understanding. And the subject of a Christian understanding of critical thinking for effective learning reminds us that we can look to God to give us strength and wisdom. And through trust in God, we can have lower anxiety and greater confidence. We can trust in lecturers and teachers, and particularly Christian lecturers and teachers and Christian schools and colleges, that they will support us and encourage us. And we'll continue to do well if we put in the time and put in that effort that we need to do. A prayer to begin. Dear Heavenly Father, as we grow in understanding and skills, and work on our assignments, we ask for your help and guidance and strength, and we ask for wisdom as we seek to develop skills and gather research and organise our thoughts, and write our essays and learn from our mistakes, so that next time we might even do better. Help us, we pray, to express our ideas clearly. Help us to learn from the work that is given back to us in our assignments, and help us also to grow as people in character and insight. Above all, we ask you to grant us courage and determination to go through challenges and obstacles that we may face, and we seek to always approach our work with humility, curiosity, and a sincere desire to learn. So we thank you for your love and support and the love and support of others around us, and we pray that we'd use these opportunities wisely. Today I want to speak about, in the application of critical thinking to our essays, or if you go on to write a scholarly journal article or to write for a magazine or a newspaper, that we need to interact with other people at the beginning in a literature review, and then as we develop the essay and look to further references, and then when we get feedback at the conclusion. Our essay has, at 3 or more stages, important interactions with others, as does any aspect of critical thinking. When you make a decision in a group or a board or as a team, whatever area of activity, you're dependent on interactions with others to bring correction and improvement in what you do. And so first of all, I want to start by looking at the task of the literature review. So in the literature review, it's important that you gather some relevant literature in which to build your resource on. Now, you may use one trick is to begin writing before you do your literature review. And the strength of that is that you get some original ideas before you do the literature review. And this might be your original thoughts before literature review. And there are advantages and disadvantages in that. you have to realize you could be getting things entirely wrong, but there could be something fresh about your first thoughts. Certainly your original thoughts before the literature review can include something about your initial ideas, and it can also include something about your initial motivations. But Daniel, what are your thoughts about writing something down, an outline, before you start your essay? And then obviously you'll have a lot more knowledge as you go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 10 or 12 or more scholarly resources. What are your thoughts on these steps?
Yeah, I have to admit that this is normally how I do it, because I like to have my own original ideas and thoughts put down on paper. And I guess when I do a literature review, I'm not so much looking to necessarily prove or disprove, what I've written down, but rather I think see where my work would fit, or where my argument would fit in the wider scholarly conversation, because it's okay to find things that might posit the opposite argument to what you're saying, because there's room in scholarship for disagreements. So, I think the good thing about that is you might come across stuff that maybe argues against what you're saying, where you think, all right, that's actually a really good point. It's going to help me address a weakness here and I can fix it. Or alternatively, you might come across something that, contradicts what you're saying, but it might help give your argument a springboard where you can frame it as a response to that, where you can frame it as an argument against that existing scholarship. So I really like the idea of at least not necessarily writing it out as it would appear, on the paper, but at least having a kind of draft and saying, these are the main thoughts, these are the main ideas, and then doing the literature review and having all those notes there and seeing what might, what parts of that literature review of the existing scholarship might work really well with my argument. What things might there be that I had never thought of? What things might there be, and this will become apparent as you do more reading, what main ideas do I really need to make sure I include here? This is particularly the case if you're venturing into a topic that you might not be as familiar with or that you haven't done before, or it will become apparent as you read from paper to paper. You might see all these recent scholars in their own literature reviews constantly refer back to some kind of original seminal work. And so that's a big indication of what the main ideas are in that field, who the main theorists are. And that's a flag that says, all right, I need to include that theorist as well, or I need to go and read that theorist too. So I think it's good. I like that idea of having the original idea and saying, okay, where does my work fit into this conversation? Is there something that, is there a scholar who seems to agree a lot with what I'm saying that I can bounce off? Is there one that seems to contradict what I'm saying, but I can form a response? It might be that sometimes I find that, the work that disagrees with what I say the most sometimes actually really helps me, because it helps fix some of the weaknesses in my argument. And you might see different avenues there, different avenues to explore. So I like that idea. That's normally how I do it, but it's not for everyone.
And it's during this initial time before you go to the resources and you contaminate your mind with the thoughts of others that you can gain some self-understanding about you and your ideas and your motivations. And for example, I wanted to write an essay once on heaven. And if I thought about it, my ideas are, I wanted to say something positive about heaven, and I wanted to say what it is and where it is, and so on. So I went to my professors in second or third year of university and I said, I want to write about this. And they told me I had to write about the history of understandings of heaven and that it had changed over time. And then what about those who don't believe in heaven? And so including those. And when they said this, I felt terribly knocked back and knocked over, because I was wanting to say something positive about heaven that'd cheer people up. as a preacher and a church attender. And when I think about it, it's good for me to think about my motivations, because part of my motivation was pastoral care. That is, when someone faces a challenge in life or someone dies at a funeral, it's quite important to have a message that is going to be useful for pastoral care, that'll bring assurance, that'll bring comfort, that'll bring hope. And so thinking about my motivations when I start is that I want to be positive, thinking more deeply. What's driving my need for positivity? Do I just want to be right? I want my views to be right. I've got to think more deeply about what's some positive motivations behind my approach for wanting to know positive things about where heaven is and what it does. And other professors are saying, hang on, that's too narrow an essay. You're not going to get beyond a pass or so there. You've got to think of the history of understandings as how this has changed over 2,000 years. And then you've got to think about, what about those who don't believe? Where will they stand? And you mentioned this before, Daniel, about those who've got different views. And so when I started to put together this combination of heaven and then the history and then those who don't believe, but then I went on to go back to my initial thoughts about I am interested in pastoral care and funerals. And I'm seeing that this positive approach at a church service where you're speaking to people is beneficial, because it's aligning them with something that cheers them up. And then I came across some French philosophers who talked about phenomenology. And so they're not talking about whether heaven so much exists or whether heaven does not exist like the atheists. They're talking about what is the phenomenological experience of those who are talking about heaven at, say, a funeral church service. And the phenomenological experience is that they're looking for comfort, they're looking for hope, they're looking for assurance. And though it's not surprising that the sermons are more on comfort and hope than bad luck, guys, there may not be a heaven. That doesn't make for a good church service at a funeral. And so the phenomenological approach of the French philosophers then gave me quite a nice approach. And so if I then restructure my approach to this essay on heaven and now introduce this concept of phenomenology, I then have quite a nice flow that combines through the more academic approaches there. But as you're now saying, Daniel, having thought through what's my motivations behind doing this essay on education. And so a similar thing, if I was doing on education, I might begin by thinking for essay 1, 2, or 3, what do I think of education? And so I might write down some of my thoughts. And then I might go a bit deeper. I don't want to just look like an ego and look at like a superhero as a teacher. I might want to, think more deeply about education and helping people and humility and love and listening. And so as I begin to explore my thoughts, it's helpful. And then I look at the essay question and I begin to write down my initial response before I see it first up. That is helpful. And then I go on to the literature review. Any further thoughts about these self-understandings that come before we get contaminated by the literature? Because the moment you read your first piece of literature, you'll think, he's the brilliant guy who spent 20 years at it. I've spent 20 minutes at it, and you just give in and you follow whatever he says. Then you read your second piece of literature and it's a bit different. And now you're a bit torn between the two, and you read your third piece and you're torn between the three. But there's something important happens at this first stage in which there is some originality, because you're thinking about you're the only you who can write this original viewpoint. You're thinking a bit about your context. You're a Christian, maybe. You've been brought up in a certain Christian environment. This is the way you are at presently seeing the world. I think it's great to acknowledge that There's a certain level of subjectivity, which Soren Kierkegaard says it's going to be important. This is your agency and your contribution. But there's also going to come a huge amount of objectivity where you're going to look at it from an outsider view from here on in. So write down your subjective personal views before you start. Realize you might have to surrender them and put them to one aside as you go on, because they may not work in the context of the essay, and you just put that in another file that you keep at home and you don't hand it in. What are your thoughts on the value of writing before the essay begins, planning before the essay begins, Daniel, before we move on to the value of doing the literature review?
Yeah, I think it's really valuable. And the reason why is that I find that it gets a lot of our thoughts out of our head. It makes the cognitive load easier because all of a sudden they're on paper and I don't have to try and carry it all around with me. But the other thing that I do when I put it on paper is I try and put it down on paper according to what I think the rough structure of the essay will be. So I end up having two working documents normally. I have one Word doc that is all my notes, all my thoughts, and this will be a combination. Normally, this document will just be my own thoughts, my own observations, my own arguments. And then as I go and read the literature, I'll include in this document, I won't include lengthy quotes from the literature. I might include, just a few sentence quotes here or there, and I might just put in, after I've got an idea of my own, I'll say something like, see page 62 of Smith for how this might work in relation to X or Y, or I might have a sentence there, where I'll say, explain how I'll have my own original idea, then underneath I'll say, explain how this goes against the theory of Jones or something like that. So this working document starts with my own ideas, then it has, the literature included as I go along, and it's all done in that kind of structure, or the rough structure of how I think that essay will work. And then when I start writing it, I do it in a separate document, and it's almost like I have this kind of step-by-step process that I just go boom, 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 right. And that just really, I find that really reduces the cognitive load, because I'm not trying to carry around all this stuff in my head. I've got this plan that I can refer to. And that goes back to what we were saying in terms of, giving our brain, before we started recording, Sam, we we're talking about importance of taking a break while we're working to get the brain to reboot. And I find that doing it that way means that my brain is a lot more agile. I can think of new ideas as I'm typing as well, which is really, really helpful. So I found that that's a really useful way to do it. But everyone's different. But I encourage those of you watching to think about how you might document your ideas and your research to open up, your brain a little bit when you are writing, and give yourself less weight to carry.
And I really like this idea of reducing cognitive load. Write the words down. I, like you, write quotes. When I remember, I put them in quotation marks, word for word, and then I put the source, and I might go to Google Scholar, and then I might be writing about heaven, or I might be writing about education, and the importance of families, and school connection. And I've made a comment, say in a paragraph, that when I reflect on my upbringing, I remember family was important. And so when I'm a school teacher, I'm going to try and build connections there. And when I go down, I then find some resources. And then one of these resources, if I'm able to read that book, I can then also cite it. And so we've got a citation here. So I make a note of the citation. And so I put that in my rough notes that I'm going to go to later, and then we've gone to there. One of the things I hope is someone might have summarized the book for me, and so I've got a summary down here as well. And then if I put in a summary, and then I'll have a look in the college library, then I could find some other material, and I could even explore who the author is. And so this then leads on to further resources that I can then explore. So I'm starting to build up some material here, and then I would save this to a separate page, Daniel. So I've got the summary of the book here. I've got more options. I could find it and so on. So I'm now starting to build a list of things that they've got in here. So Control C, I make a copy of it, and then I make another copy of it. And this now then becomes a separate document. And so I then save that document now as Booth and Dunn, 1996. And my referencing is not perfect as yet, but it's going to get there before I hand my assignment in. And so I might now save that as family-based schooling. So we've got Booth and Durham. I've saved that. I now have in my rough notes Booth and Durham, and then I could make some note that I've got see my page on this. So I've saved a copy of it, and I'm working on that because I see that as good. So like you, Daniel, I've got this growing document that began with these ideas, as we said, about heaven. So I've got a rough thing, and I'm starting to explore there. I've even got in here a little bit of journal. So this is my journal, and there I'm writing down, why am I so interested in heaven? And I'm beginning to write these things down. So can you see how I'm gathering notes? This is document 1, and I'm gathering resources. I'm making separate pages. I may even have a file on my computer now that's growing. I've got 5 or 6 of these documents that I'm saving, which are scholarly articles that I'm getting from Google Scholar and from the college library, books online, and so on. So gathering that. And as you say, I might even use other symbols where I write my original ideas, or I remind myself I've got to do some tasks. So I make a note of these sorts of things. Then I often cut and paste this sort of material into the second document, in which I've got my intro, which I do at the end. Then I've got a rough idea of 5 paragraphs or 8 paragraphs, and I'm starting to develop that. So I really like that. I like your idea, Daniel, of giving brain space recreation or recreation, going for a walk. Some people will work in the afternoon, and then first thing next morning, they take the dog for a walk, they go for a walk, and then ideas will come to them, or they'll come to them in the middle of the night, and then under their pillow, so that others don't see that they're making notes about, and then they'll hear a voice, go to sleep, it's 1 a.m., and they know that that's the end of their opportunity to make notes in the middle of the night. And so I think this taking a break every hour for 10 minutes, going for a walk, all of these things help to reboot the brain and to develop document 2. The next step, of course, is developing the literature review. And I've put this first today, the reminder that it's the literature review that's going to be the real strength that sets up the success of your assignment. And so if you've just got third-hand articles, they're in a scholarly journal, but they're third-hand, then they're not going to be as strong as if you got the key primary resources. So the secret is to find really good, strong scholarly resources. And here we've got one, How Teachers Come to Understand Families. So I grabbed that one. And if I quite like that one, this is really good, I think I could use that. So again, I can cite that and I can start developing rough notes on that, but I'm going to examine this even further. I'm going to look for ways I can even critique that a bit. So back here in document 1, I've got some ideas about family and school that I'm gathering. I want to also save the web address in case I lose it. So I make a copy of the web address there, and then I'm going to start to make more and more notes on this resource as I read through it there. And so I'll keep working my way through, and then I have to be careful, because if I cut and paste some notes, one of the things I do like to think about is who the author is. So Tim Kelly, a second grade student in a small rural country town, or actually that might be about, no, that's about one of the students. It's not about the author. So the author's Mary Caspi. So I may do a search on Mary S. Caspi and education, and I may, in fact, want to get a bit more information on her, and I would write that down. Mary Caspi, a teacher at a university in England, etc. So I could have half a sentence on that, would lift my essay. And then they're saying Mary Caspi has an analysis of 13 in-depth teacher interviews, and that they're looking at the homeschool partnerships. Now, some of it I could cut and paste. The danger is, if I do, I've now got all sorts of plagiarism problems. I usually prefer to write in my own words, and I avoid that. So in research done by Margaret, and sometimes you can speed the process up. Again, there's huge dangers, and my wife warns me about doing this by cut and pasting. If I don't watch out, I've left the S full stop in. So, and it's a different font, and the teacher's going to see it's a different font and be suspicious from the start. In research done by Margaret Caspi in analysing oh yes, it's underlined my misspelling. So when it makes a misspelling, I can either respell it or I can click. And so again, you can use the computer to help you a little bit. I've got to then make a decision, is this the Z analysing or the S analysing? And so when I do my editing, I'll check that it's all the same. In analysing 13, and see, I don't need the in-depth teacher thing that I made the note of. I could say in analysing interviews in a school, and so 13 interviews, parent-teacher interviews. And so notice my words are now coming in. So it's clear that this is my work in my writing, and I've avoided that whole plagiarism danger there. So yeah, that's the way I collect notes and gather them. And I keep trying to think ahead, as you were saying, Daniel. Where's this discussion going? And it is because I think that parent influence is important. Any further comments on this gathering material from resources, building the notes, avoiding plagiarism?
No, I think we've covered some of the key thoughts that I think I've had, and certainly I think that watching out with the copy and pasting is good.
That's good. You notice in this
article, me a big flag.
This article that she wrote, she begins with a literature review, and that's what we're emphasizing now, is that it's this initial literature review that is often the strength or weakness of your assignment. And my suggestion is usually you try and gather something like 10 to 12 or more. And if you manage to gather 15, 20, 25, you'll end up with more scholarly resources. And then you're probably initially going to be working with one. So you begin with one, the best out of these 10 or 12 or more that you like, and then you begin to read. Now, one of the challenges, you don't have time to read more than a page or two. So my thought is you need to begin with a skim read. And so you need to think, where is the best 2 or 3 pages to read? And often that will be the introduction somewhere. So I go to the introduction, and then if I discover that it's not saying something interesting, I go to the first interesting paragraph in the interesting where I begin. So here I read the abstract. We got 13 in-depth interviews, rural New England school. So this could be America if it's New England rather than England. And then findings suggest 2 key processes. And so she says there's 2 key processes for understanding family gather of information. There's communication and observation. Interestingly, she then says comparison. I usually drop the word "to" from the 2 key processes, and I make it key processes, and that way I can expand on it, etc. And then, interestingly, Daniel, it says they do comparison with other families and one's own families, and that this occurs over time. So I find that quite fascinating as, if others are doing well in music or others are doing not so well, people will compare and think, where am I? And if my child's the bottom 1/3, then make no effort because it's over for you. Give up. I speak to families who give up on a child for 2 or 3 years, and then suddenly the child gets it. And they think, where did that come from? We didn't. I see guys go on and become professors of poetry, and their family gave up on from them and said, don't bother about that. You haven't got the brains for it. Have you thought of becoming a carpenter or something? At least you'd be good with your hands, They go on and become a professor of something. It's so families really do influence what happens. And one of the interesting things that Mary Casby's saying, it's this comparison makes the difference. And what an implication for us as teachers. The more you indicate that this 1/3 of the class are bright, this 1/3 of the class might struggle through. And the other 1/3, forget about learning anything because you've lost it. How wrong that can be. Einstein would never have left the patent office to get a job as a university professor because he was written off.
Yeah.
And half of all professors are written off, aren't they? And so I gather the notes then on insights like this from Casby, which I'm getting quite worked up about. And so I now have key processes to understand. And so again, I'm almost doing bad paraphrasing here. Key processes for understanding families. And I'm thinking the relationship between families and schooling and education. So my mind's constantly running as to how I would write this in my own words. And so now I'm halfway between the original material. Sometimes it's worth saving the original material in inverted commas, in that you might want to go back to it at times. So you might want to actually save what Casby's said there. And so this paper we'll look at. And so you might want to cut those in and save them because you'll always have them in this document 1, but not in document 2, which is the one you hand in. So we've got these sorts of materials that we're gathering about how they get information through communication. Actually, I could even make that inverted commas because that's still in her words. That would be plagiarism. And then the 2 ways are communication and observation. And I'm quite keen on these ideas in that I now have 3 ideas: communication, observation, and comparison, and even comparison with other members in one's own family. So you can see it's gone beyond the 2 that she said, and now it's 4. So I'd say Mary Casby, she identifies key processes between family, schooling, education, and these are communication, which can be the newsletters and everything, observation, what's happening, comparisons with other families, So that's all part of my developing that paragraph, and then I'll have another paragraph. And then down here, she's written a literature review. This is the first really good informative material here, so I'll probably borrow from that a bit. However, like she said, that these people have all written about, and I've bitten off way more than I can chew. I've got an elephant here. So every one of these has written on families and there. And so I've got way more material than I could ever want. Imagine if I grab one of these, put it into Google Scholar or Google, or go to the library catalogue and put it in there. Education and importance of families, school connection, and put in this, see what happens. And it may bring up other articles that Hoover and Dempsey have written. And here's the actual article. So I've got the citation of the article. I've got some access to it. I think it's 1995. Yeah, so I found the article. I'm now exploring that. And this is going way beyond what you as students may do, but this is what Daniel and I are often doing all the time. I think, Daniel, we're, writing these papers that we hope will make us famous, and a very small opportunity of being wealthy. At least they may pay our conference fees, which would be useful. So, Daniel, your thoughts on beginning the literature review. We've written down some key thoughts that we're working with. I'm saying here, I've got this initial idea of families' relationship to schools. Unfortunately, this has gone into a rabbit track, and I've got to be really careful now that I'm not getting away from the essay question. And unfortunately, my interest has grown. So the rabbit track has actually become a highway. And again, you've got to be careful that I could be writing another essay that has nothing to do there.
Yeah, you definitely don't want it to turn into a literature review, because you've got to still have your own argument. One thing that I say to students sometimes is, when they have big, lengthy block quotes from some of these sources, I say, well, the downside of that is that, if you've only got 1,500, 2,000 words, it's drowning out your own voice and your own argument. You really need to consider what are the best and sharpest quotes to use. And, think about as well, in terms of the word limit, if you've got a 1,500 word essay, you really don't want to be spending, you don't want to be more than, say, I reckon 300 words in, 350 even, and still doing a lit review. That would be max for me. You want to be able to get on track with your own argument. And you can actually incorporate some of that literature later on. It doesn't all have to be, kind of signposted at the front. It can be sprinkled throughout. So I think, on that note, remember the importance of having your own voice and your own argument come through, and recognize that, depending on how big your essay is, you really don't want to be going down that kind of highway, so to speak. So, in a 1,500 word essay, about 300, if it is an essay that actually requires that literature review, it could be, more of a personal reflection. It might be a type of response in which some of that literature will be sprinkled throughout and not necessarily signposted at the beginning. So that's my advice, is remember that you're the person making the argument here. You don't want to be, you don't want to drown out your own voice.
I like that. So you've got to keep this balance happening. And one way to do that is to either open this separate document, which is one page on family and school and home and school. So you develop this document, and because we only want 300 words eventually from this sort of literature on this particular subtopic there, we want to eventually get it down to 300 words. Now, of course, if my interest generates 900 words, that's not necessarily a bad thing, or even 2,000 words. It's not necessarily a bad thing. But remember, you don't have to polish up all 900 words or all 2,000 words. You can have quote, quote, quote in this material, because you're not actually handing in this sort of material. So this can be rough notes, this can be direct quotes, Most importantly, you do want the references. Most importantly, when it's direct quotes, put the quotation marks around them. And you could even do this as a presentation at church or school where you just put up the quotes. They'll love it on a PowerPoint slide. And then you are wanting to eventually get the 300 words from this 900 words, 2,000 words of quotes in the material. And that's where it's really going to count. And that's where you start to work again. I've now been reading, say, for an hour or two on the relationship between home and school. 4 things may keep standing out. Communication, observation, comparison, and that's coming from Margaret Caspi, in which she has said these things. So I'm now possibly ready to write up that 300 words. And one of the ways I may now start to rework this in research done by Margaret Caspi, and then I need to grab 2003. So that's the major thing I want. I'll need to look up the page number. And so I have to remind myself that I've still got to go back and find that page number. So I've got 2003, and then I've got page, and then I might put XX and the star there, reminding me I've still got to find that page. In analysing parent-teacher interviews in I really like that word, New England school. So that's coming back, England school at, and then again, XX. I've got to look up where the location of this New England school is. She identified, and I've now got 4 main influence, 4 main relationships, say. And then I'm now beginning to look at these 4 roles because I'm quite fascinating by them. And I could actually have all of them together in one sentence. And then I could have another sentence where it says communication. To tread on very dangerous grounds briefly, Daniel, some people have said, what happens if I then take Margaret Caspi identified 4 relationships and put it into one of these newfangled things like ChatGPT? It could then generate it. And so if we were to do this very naughty thing, they've said that they're not going to even allow us to go ahead, and we've broken some laws, probably in the... All right, so I've now got... They didn't like that. Yeah, isn't that interesting? Hopefully they're going to let me restart it. That'd be a good warning for the student, is that... Right, isn't that very interesting? It's because I had these other terms in there that they were... All right, so here we go. We've got... And they really hate the word XX. So I've got Margaret Caspi, parent-teacher interviews. See if it's still going to do it. But what I'm going to warn students about is that this won't be in your own words, so you can't use it. But if, I was saying to Daniel, you're really tired of an afternoon, you can't get a thought together, some of you are going to be tempted to do this. So I thought I'll just give you a warning that this is, you have to put it all in your own words. You can't analyse in what this says. Here we go. You've provided incomplete information. All right. All right. Let me
might be for the best that we're not.
Yeah, not go there.
Much like, I don't know.
All right. But
I guess it's signposts, I think, Sam. Yeah. Not just, I think the I don't want to say pitfalls, but I guess the challenges of using, AI and ChatGPT and rephrasing tools and whatever else. I think there are the obvious things that we talk about in terms of how, utilizing these technologies risks an undermining of academic integrity, and risks, an over-reliance on AI in these instances means that, it's really, it becomes a paper that's not your own. But also the fact that, as we're experiencing now, it's not a surefire, it's not a surefire solution anyway.
You can
Right?
take it the right, you get something true. So it's now come up with something, but again, I'm reminding students that you can't use this because sure thing, Turnitin is going to tell us this came from ChatGPT because Turnitin actually has the algorithms and there are words that are used in there, and you'll be asked to resubmit if you do this. Now, notice as well that ChatGPT has only done what you could do. That is, parent-teacher relationships and home life influences schools. I know that already. I don't need ChatGPT to do it. And you know that already, don't you? So parent-teacher relationships and home life influences schools and schooling. And it is important for the success of students, to etc. And then notice that they've only said what we know already, that communication is important, and communication builds strong relationships. You should know that anyway, and you could write that in your own words. It says here, observation. Parents are going to observe what goes on at school. School want to get good, healthy perspectives, etc. But you're going to know that anyway. Much better than that would be to start to look up some of the things that Mary Caspi says, or the relationship says. And if you were to go to Google Scholar and put in these same sort of materials, then I think that would be much healthier. So parent-home connection with schooling, or with schools and education success. And then one thing you could even look at here is each of these four, which is communication, and then you could go through. So how teachers come to understand families. So we've got one here. We've got a citation of it. So can you see this is much better than ChatGPT? You've actually got the article you can read, you got the citation and the material. And then instead of communication, we then talked quite a bit about comparison before, and we can talk about comparisons here. And we've got teaching the teachers, preparing educators to engage with families for student achievement. And again, you can cite it, you can go to the article, you can write a summary, you can quote it and build. Isn't that much better than going to ChatGPT? So students,
It is.
avoid ChatGPT. And I was going to say, unless you're really tired and it's late afternoon, etc. But then even then, realize it's not going to do you any better than you'll do 10 times better by going to your school library, picking up 10 books. Reminds me of the time, Daniel, I went to the school library and I got 3 or 4 books and I sat down and started reading them. And another person I knew was doing a bit of research and they went down and they thought 3 or 4 that Sam Hayes got, not really the thing. So they started collecting more, and over the next half hour, they were growing their pile. They were going to do research that was going to change the world. And then over the loudspeaker, this library will close in 10 minutes. And they had not yet sat down. And these were reference-only books that they could not use. And I thought, better my 3 books than their 10 or 12 or 15, which they'd not got round to using. So certainly the gathering of information through the literature review, which is giving you 300 words. And this could be 300 words on each of the subtopics. There could be, in assignment 2, there's sort of 3 major subtopics that you look at there. You might gather 300 words of literature review, and you might have 600-800 words of gathered very rough notes on another page, but the final product, it's like my wife is cooking and she's making an apple cake. She doesn't throw the apple skin in. She doesn't throw the apple pips in. All of that gets thrown out. I mean, 70% gets thrown away, and it's only the nice apples that are baked with a pastry around them that gets handed in. And it's the same with the student. It's that which is well developed and baked within that is going to be so important. Research process then is gathering the information, and then there's note-taking, which we've been talking about here. Don't include unsubstantiated notes where it's just your ideas. Every time you've got an idea, find a scholarly resource that interacts with your idea. Even better, find 3 or 4 scholarly resources that interact with your idea. Every time you put a scholarly resource into a paragraph, think about putting 2 or 3 in and start an analysis and discussion rather than just the one resource. But make sure there's at least one scholarly resource in most of your paragraphs to keep Daniel and Dr. Sam Hay engaged and interested and thinking that you're engaging with scholars on the way through. You will have writer's block at times. Go for a walk, take some notes, chat with someone, go for a walk and take your smartphone and speak into it. Not really sure what I'm doing about this assignment, pretty annoyed by it actually. But I suppose if I was to think a bit more deeply about it, they want us to write about heaven from their perspective, scholarly, whereas I want to write about it from mine. So you put these notes together, and if you want to listen to them together, you'll have some sentences that you could actually start working with. You may not necessarily start from the beginning. You might start from the middle, or you might start from the last paragraph. That can help as well. Often we're taught to think in linear fashion. It's actually the final product that needs to be in linear, logical time order to the reader. So think about the reader when they read it, and if you can get a relative to read it, that's helpful. Then as you go through the writing process, start working through the outlining. Really only half of your work time should be given to gathering the information. Over half of your time should be given to structuring, restructuring, drafting and redrafting and revising, because it's not the lumps of wood that you try and tell them this is a table and the people say that's one flat bit of wood and 4 bits of wood that are, they're not impressed. You say, yeah, but it'd be a table if you want to do it. Well, I'm not going to pay $200 for 5 lumps of wood and you call it a table. I want it sanded and painted and finished and estopoled and just like the picture said. Or can I use a quote of a overseas company that makes these flat packs? That's not a finished product. People want the finished product. I mean, you can photocopy the pages of a book and hand them in to us, Daniel and Sam. I mean, we'll only be able to give you the marks of a photocopier, yep. 1 out of 100 or something. That's not the finished product. It has to be reworked, include your own words as well. So you've got to work through the material there as well. The other thing I wanted to spend some time thinking about is the way in which at the end you get feedback from people. And so I just want to spend a bit of time thinking about learning from the marked work at the end. So finally, you've spent this time producing the assignment, you've edited it and reworked it, and you get the assignment back. So much of learning from what you have done comes from the process of gathering, the process of reading, the process of just visually seeing the way other scholars are laying the work out. So as you're reading through, you're seeing examples of paragraphs, that sticks in your mind. You're seeing examples of referencing, that sticks in your mind. You see that this person is quoted in one paragraph, that many references and this many references. This scares you, you're about to give up. And so, but you're developing ideas about the way different scholars write, and you're comforted by your teachers. No, you just need to put in the time and you will do well. You've got potential. And then you get the feedback from the marked work, and your teachers usually write comments and suggestions on your work. Often we don't want to look at them too much On the day we get it back, we go straight to the grade. Some of you then don't want to look at them for a couple of days because there's some negative comments in there for a while. You've got to engage with the comments because you learn so much from how to improve from the comments, how to develop your writing skills, how to develop your grades. Rather than get angry about a low grade, look through the comments and accept it. This is the learning journey of life. And the more mistakes you make, the more you can learn. We should encourage students, Daniel, the lower the grade they get, the more things they can learn out of this, the more room for improvement that they've got, the greater the growth opportunity that they've got. We should tell this to every student who's struggling, is that you've got opportunity. And you can do eventually better than everyone else. You may get some abbreviations in, so you might want to look up those sort of abbreviations like e.g. an example or illustration is needed, EX or explain. So you could look up some of these or ask your lecturer, what do you mean by LC, change to lowercase, or UC, change to uppercase, or P, what's your punctuation? So you may get some of those depending on your lecturer, but be aware that they may use these. Some will write longer comments, some shorter comments. So do carefully consider your grades and written comments in the light of the information on the grades given in the handbooks. Daniel, what can we do to do better at learning from the grade we get back rather than not look at it for fear that it might make us feel not so good?
Yeah, there's one strategy I've seen used in high schools, and I'm not suggesting necessarily that we use this, but I guess highlighting it to explain the importance of reflection, where teachers will give students the feedback, but not the actual mark. And
That's
what
an
that
interesting
prompts
point. Yeah.
students to do is to read through and actually understand the strengths and weaknesses of their response. And then they're required to write just a brief paragraph on how they could improve their response in the future, but also some things, that were quite strong about it. And then they get their mark back. And what that does is it makes students actually actively and meaningfully think about how they can improve their work. And so, I don't know that there's necessarily a way that we could do that on Turnitin, and I'm not necessarily suggesting that we do, but I think, one thing that, our students, in critical thinking are going to discover throughout their degree as they train to become teachers is the importance that we are teaching students for the purposes of broader and more important outcomes than a raw mark. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of, I know I've done it, but I don't want to speak for you, Sam, but I know a lot of other professors have probably failed assessments at times in either high school or uni. So it happens, it happens to everyone. Not all of us are always getting HDs, and that's okay. And what makes the best teachers, what makes the best scholars are not the ones who, are always, getting, Ds and HDs, are actually the ones who are thinking critically about how to best improve themselves, because that will actually translate over into critical life and professional skills outside simple essay writing or, a research article or something like that. It'll translate into teaching. It'll translate into professional development, into curriculum writing as well, in terms of critically thinking about how can I improve, my own understanding? How can I use this as a learning experience? So, no one's perfect, and that's okay. So focus, if I can encourage you, focus on what the feedback is rather than the mark.
And you may get comments like your paragraphs need work. And if you Google Australian universities paragraph in essay writing, those sorts of things, you'll get 5 or 6 or more universities across Australia, every state of Australia, will be telling students you can develop your paragraphs this way. And the same with essay writing. You Google that, essay writing, Australian universities, you'll find lots will tell you how to do that. And then you'll have a think about, each time I write an essay, I have a think about, how am I going with my paragraph structures? Do my paragraphs have the first sentence as the topic sentence that lets the reader know this is what the paragraph is about? Do I have linking sentences at the end and the next one? Do I keep beginning the same way with the sentences in my paragraph? Do I have a single thought or idea for each of the paragraphs? Sometimes I will go back and I will put the idea in a little subheading that I'll remove later, and I'll say, something about paragraphs develop, and then I might have 4 things that paragraphs develop, including 1 main idea, and then and so I've got an idea what this paragraph is about. It's developing these. I'm not going to delete those later, but that's what I want to introduce. So the paragraph's the basic unit, has a group of sentences focused on one idea or topic, and so on. And then it says here, of course, as there's a series of paragraphs in an essay, every one of them must be linked and flow into the next one. So if you suddenly jump to a new subtopic or idea, you suddenly want to talk about your experiences, you've got to then build a link, and you might have half a sentence which says, illustrating this point is my own life example and experience, which says. So it's the linking linking sentences are going to be very important for making this work. So linking sentences are important. So paragraph development will be something that you could have some comments about, and then there are different sentences. You could look this up at the many universities. Your writing style, we prefer third person over first person usually. We prefer simple English, and so there's a number of things that you can do to improve your writing style and to say it very precisely and simply. Again, you don't want to get into trouble by doing the wrong thing there. So work to improve your writing style every time you work. Choose your words carefully. Again, reduce your wordiness where you can. All of this is online under universities and how to write essays. Try and write in the 1 tense, which is usually the past tense, and there's lots of other information along these lines. One thing I encourage students to do is to keep a journal. And again, you've got document 1, document 2. This could be document 3, where you write down, this is what I'm hoping to get out of this essay, and this can aid your personal and professional development. And journal writing can help you develop your writing skills. If you do some of this every day, it can help develop your thinking skills because you lay out the logic of what you're thinking about. And your journal writing and further research that you do can help in developing skills in researching even more and coming up with original ideas that'll get you higher grades. And you can even analyze and evaluate your own thoughts and actions in your journal writing. You can question yourself, reflect on what you are doing. It increases self-awareness, makes a better leader, a better teacher who's aware of their strengths and limitations through journal writing, and it promotes personal growth. Writing essays at university level can also develop your character and perseverance, resilience, critical thinking. That is, you can overcome the challenges, and usually to overcome the challenges you need quite a few more positive feedbacks than the negative ones, and we as teachers are happy to give you positive feedback, so you can contact us if you want those, and we can do that. We believe in you, we encourage you. As well as that, you can give yourself positive feedbacks, and you may have only got 45% and not doing so well on this one. You've still got 45, be encouraged, but you got a lot of room for improvement. And, be aware that we believe that you can make it if you follow the guidelines. 45 should give you some warnings as well. So develop an awareness of self through your essay writing. Daniel, what do you think of the benefits of journal writing, reflecting, reading the comments, and then building up my confidence in myself, realizing, as you've said, we've got some HDs. And when you get HDs, you know that there's been one or two or more subjects that you've aligned with what they're looking for. You've found what they're looking for, and you could have success in a job in that area that you got your HDs in. You and I, at times, would have failed a subject, and we would love to get work in that area. And we realize we've either missed the question, we've caught the teacher on a bad day. There's also we had influenza at the time and weren't aware of it. There's a lot of, I know one person who got an illness when he was sitting his year 12 exam, wanted to go into medicine, and he failed because he got the illness. He then studied similar subjects at first year uni with me, and then at the end of the first year he got an illness again and got low grades, and he wanted to transition into medicine. And then the following year, he's still a bit glum, but he still worked at it. And the following year, it was battling and so on. When we had the birth of our child in the hospital, the doctor came along to see us, having graduated as a doctor and now working in the hospital. And I think he's gone on to be a brilliant doctor doing well. And so you can get low marks, you can persevere, and you can push through. But Daniel, how do we go with this aspect of journaling, reflecting, encouraging ourselves?
Yeah, I think it's important. I think because it helps you become a reflective learner and a reflective teacher as well. I think what it does is it signposts for you not only areas to improve upon, but I think areas of strength. I think in mentioning future careers, I think you've highlighted something important there where, maybe for some of you, you might still be figuring out, what your area of teaching might be. There might be specific elements of educational leadership that you think maybe later on in your career you'd like to get to. And so I think the importance of the journal is not only helping you in terms of future assessments, it's also helping you in terms of your future career and figuring out, okay, what are areas that you might be really good at, or areas that you might find that you're really passionate about that you'd never thought of before. And I think for a lot of us, sometimes that's kind of how we find our fields. When I trained as a teacher, I was originally training to be a modern history and geography teacher. English is my area now. I wasn't training to be an English teacher, and I did one subject of geoscience at Macquarie in my first semester. And back in those days, they had what are called conceded passes. You get close enough to a pass that they just kind of let you through. So I think my final grade for that geoscience subject was 49, and they let me through. And I think I realized maybe I shouldn't be a geography teacher. And I just took an English subject on a whim and really enjoyed it and did really well in it. And I thought, actually, maybe this is for me.
So certainly the feedback gives us an insight into where our strengths are. And when we see our weaknesses, we've got to decide, am I not a golfer or a tennis player? Am I not an essay writer or am I not a geologist, etc.? And I think everyone who does uni, there are subjects and areas that they had of interest that they've dropped, aren't they? But we're learning about ourselves as we go through and where our passions and interests are. Try something new, explore something new. Further comments, Daniel?
No, I think that's good. I think we've touched on some really interesting things. I think we've discussed not only some of the mechanics of essay writing, but I think some of the important things about reflecting on our work and probably relating back to a little bit of some of the previous things we've talked about in the unit in this regard as well.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
certainly that's great. That is really terrific, and I love the stories behind it as well. So your essay applies a little bit to where you'll go in the future. You're gathering information that you'll use in jobs, and if you don't like the sort of area that you're exploring, and there are alternatives, and you've got, even as a teacher, you've got to decide, doing the pracs, doing the research, is this something you're passionate about, or are there other areas? So certainly keep reflecting on, where are your strengths, where are your passions, what's aligning up with where you want to go. Keep a balanced life development, and the feedback from your essays can give you some insights into that. Feedback from your essays can open up new areas that you're interested in. Some people are interested in addressing the behavioural challenges, and they want to explore that. We need teachers in schools who can address that. Some are interested in working with 1 year level rather than another year level, one subject rather than another subject. So keep your ears and eyes open for those areas that you have interest in. And research can provide practical solutions to real world problems. So what's the big questions that your writing is touching on? What's the careers that you could go into through this? How can your assignment have practical application? And in the last paragraph or so, you might add some practical application areas. So there's a few thoughts on essay writing, with a focus on the literature review, preceding the literature review, a little bit on structure, and a little bit on conclusions. And we've also given you some ideas about how you can get resources from various areas. And we've said the best areas are the scholarly books, the scholarly journal articles that you can access, read yourself, and put in your own words, because they grow you as the student. They're not just taking ideas from others. They are part of who you are and part of your growing skills and knowledge. So thank you, each one. And we've very much enjoyed working through each week with you, and working through the ways you can now take all that you're learning and you can apply that in the areas you'll be working, and for many of you, most of you, in schools and teaching. Thank you.